Many of the various conspiratorial and paranormal breadcrumbs to some of the most interesting stories, mysteries, and cover-ups out there. And with me is just the guy to do it. Nick Redfern back in the saddle once again, the hardest working conspiracy author on this island Earth. We've talked to him before about his books Monster Files, The Real Men in Black, The Pyramid and the Pentagon, For Nobody's Eyes Only, and Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind over the course of the Higherside Chats lifetime. Well, once again, he's churned out yet another great book called Secret History, Conspiracies from Ancient Aliens to the New World Order that explores the details behind 60 different topics and weighs in at 400 pages, a conspiratorial grab bag of goodness, and I'm psyched to have him here to talk about some of it. Nick, my man, welcome back.
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I love this book, and obviously a lot of my interviews start off with me saying kind of something like that, but honestly, it covers so much. It's probably my new favorite conspiracy encyclopedia-style book, man.
Oh, well, thanks a lot. I mean, what I tried to do with the book is what I always try and do with a book, is give the reader something new. And I thought when Visible Ink, the publisher, asked me to do the book, you know, they're pretty flexible. They're a good company to work with. And they said, well, you know, we want a book on conspiracies, but just do it the way you want to do it. So I put a synopsis together and said, well, how about this? That instead of just sort of 10 or 15 top conspiracies where each one runs for like 25, 30 pages or whatever, why not give the readers sort of 60 cases where you'd still within the page count be able to give a good solid overview of the cases and the theories and everything else, but also touch upon some lesser known conspiracies, and also where they're well-known ones, bring new information to the table. And they like the approach, and so that's basically what I did with it.
Yeah, man, it's like a conspiracy 101 textbook. I think it's perfect to give to skeptics or people in your life who might think you've gone off the deep end, for people who are listening to this kind of stuff, because you can give it to them in just a few short pages. They can kind of get the gist of it and dig deeper if they want. Yeah,
and I think this is one of the issues with a lot of books on conspiracy theories, is that through no fault of any author, very often conspiracy theories are extremely complex, and so they typically don't attract audiences outside of the conspiracy field, you know, where we might sit down and sort of dig deep into a 400-page new book on the Kennedy assassination. You know, it's sort of so rich in data that a lot of people are like, well, you know, I don't believe in conspiracies and I'm not going to read a 400-page book on this one theory. But I found that people actually like it when you're not sort of cutting it short or cutting corners, but you do sort of an extensive chapter that covers the different theories, like with the Kennedy assassination or Roswell, presents the different theories and scenarios to the reader, tries to figure out which ones are the most likely ones, and explain how and why. And I think people even outside the field can appreciate that, you know, that they might take half an hour to read one of the chapters or whatever, and they think, wow, you know, I've got an overview of it, whether I agree with it or not. I understand what the conspiracy theory is now, and I think that's one of the issues with a lot of conspiracy theories. They're so far wide-ranging and complex that a lot of people just don't understand necessarily the full complexity of it, you know.
Yeah. I'm with you, man. So let's dive into some of this stuff. To kick it off, let's go into the old stuff, the biblical stuff. You make a pretty interesting case that Moses' experience with the Ten Commandments story might have been a misinterpretation of a UFO encounter, and I think that's pretty intriguing. How would you make the case for that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first section of the book deals totally with sort of ancient astronaut scenarios. And the reason why I wanted to include that in a book on conspiracies is because, you know, we know that over the years centuries, we know that various ancient religious texts and manuscripts have been rewritten, reworked, translated, parts have been deleted and changed around according to the sort of the ideas and beliefs of the people of the era or the place. And so in that sense, it's relevant because it's not just about ancient alien stuff, but it's also about us rewriting portions of what we're told is historical fact, changing things, as I said, according to the beliefs at the time. This sort of brings us into the issue that you mentioned about Moses and the Ten Commandments. Now, regardless of what people think of it, everybody knows the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments. Essentially, he goes up the mountain, Mount Sinai, I should say, goes up the mountain, and essentially, you can sort of put like a UFO spin on it, because he goes into up the mountain and sees the burning bush, which some people have perceived as like a brightly lit UFO, and then receives these 10 commandments from God, which essentially are laws laid down about what you will do versus what you won't do. You won't commit murder, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Now, why this is intriguing is because these stories of Moses and, Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments very, very closely parallel with a lot of the reports from the so-called contactees of the 1950s who claimed encounters with the so-called Space Brothers out at desert locations. And if you look at these stories, they closely parallel, as I said, the story of Moses. And that's why, I suggest in the book the theory, is it possible that Moses was actually an early contactee? For example, most of the contactees of the early to mid-1950s had their encounters out at desert locations where they felt compelled to go to specific isolated spots, sometimes in the day, very often at night, and they would climb the mountains, sometimes not even, for the first time at least, not even knowing why they were doing it. They just felt compelled to do it. And as they got high up the mountain, they would see this light in the sky, which would get bigger and closer, and then it would transform as it got closer into what you would call like a typical 1950s era flying saucer. It would land these very human, and interestingly enough, some of them described as angelic looking, sort of in this shining, bright white light, whitely lit, I should say, clothing, and long hair. And they had this sort of angelic aura to them, and they would essentially tell the contactees, we want to try and help the planet, we want to help the human race, and so we've provided these guidelines which we would like you to get out to the general public. Like, we should do away with nuclear weapons, that kind of thing. So it was almost like an upgraded situation of what came in the distant past. And again, I know that mixing religion with UFOs is sort of an inflammatory issue at the best of times, and it polarizes people into different camps. But I would urge people to sort of look at the undeniable parallels, whether they think the theory is valid or not. There are undeniable parallels between the story of Moses and the story of the contactees. As I said, the mountains, something coming down, the laws that are given by these, higher entities, and to essentially spread the word, that kind of thing. In those senses, it's very, very similar.
Yeah, and I'm not a religious guy, so I appreciate any type of potential explanation, especially one as provocative as a UFO story.
Yeah.
One story that does have a lot of parallels in particular is this George Van Tassel story. Apparently this happened near Joshua Tree of all places. Tell us about that one and kind of the information he was given during his encounter.
Well, yeah, George Van Tassel was one of the leading contactees of the 1950s, and he lived just outside of Landers in California, which isn't at all far from Joshua Tree. Now, George Van Tassel and his family moved from California. He used to work for the Hughes Aircraft Company. He was actually good friends with Howard Hughes. And but the Van Tassel family moved to Giant Rock, which is an area just outside Landers called Giant Rock because there's this gigantic rock there. And he actually made a home for himself in a large hollowed-out cavern, for want of a better term, beneath Giant Rock. And, it was like a modern-day Flintstones type environment almost. And so the family lived there. And like so many of the contactees, Van Tassel sort of gravitated towards the UFO phenomenon and felt compelled to go out into the desert night in around Landers and Giant Rock and Joshua Tree, where he would see UFOs. They would come down and essentially commune with the aliens. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the material that Van Tassel got from his alleged Space Brothers placed religion in a very different context to what traditional teachings suggest. For example, he was told that the story of Noah's Ark had a basis in fact, but the idea was that it was essentially like a space ark containing various examples of human and animal life, which possibly was brought here when some worldwide disaster was about to occur. And so essentially the story is that extraterrestrials tried to make sort of mercy-based visits and save as much as they could, and then these huge arcs would orbit the Earth until the floods and everything else calmed down. Then they would land and drop off as much as survived to start over again, that kind of thing. He also believed, based on his teachings and what he was told, that the story of Adam and Eve, he believed that Adam and Eve were actually not one man and one woman, but essentially the female and the male of the first species, which essentially was sort of like a genetically altered entity, an upgraded version of an ape using DNA manipulation and gene splicing to something closer to a human. And then we started to evolve from there. And so that was really the thrust of his story. What's interesting, this goes back to the 50s, which was sort of way, way before, obviously, things like Ancient Aliens, and even decades before Eric von Daniken. So in that sense, Van Tassel was like a real trendsetter in the Ancient Aliens world, if you like. But certainly the fact that he was saying a lot of things that in 1950s America wouldn't have gone down well with a lot of people. And the FBI opened an extensive file on him, not to debunk him. Agents actually went to visit him at his giant rock hole on several occasions to get his views on why he was claiming the aliens were here. And I actually reproduced the text of one of the documents in the book, which actually heavily focuses on the issue of religion, and the FBI took great note of what he was saying about religion and why, and he was hitting raw nerves, and people in government were a little bit concerned about it as well.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, what you said about this being in the 1950s, because in terms of the Ark story, if someone were to come out and say that today, like, it's actually kind of commonplace in ufology to think about that story, because we know about genetic samples and DNA. But in the 50s, I mean, that makes it more intriguing, because if he were to just be making that up off the top of his head, he's pretty smart.
No, you're right. And I mean, that sort of really hits home with that issue I mentioned of not many people really in sort of 53, 54 there were one or two, like Morris Jessup, but hardly anybody really in the UFO subject was focusing on the distant past. They were mainly focusing on flying saucer sightings that were going on when there was such a massive wave in the 50s and the 40s. But yeah, I mean, he covered not just sort of the Ten Commandments, the story of Noah's Ark, Adam and Eve. He also, basically essentially said that the entire world of religion was based around, visitations from extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
And what was interesting was that he also talked about Jesus, being born of Mary, but that Mary was already impregnated by extraterrestrials, and essentially that Jesus was one of them, so to speak. So in that sense, he even brought sort of the genetic angle into visitations, which really didn't kick off big time until the 70s, when alien abductions became more and more prevalent. We had one or two, like the Betty and Barney Hill case, which had like a sexual reproductive aspect to it, but it wasn't sort of fully made clear. But certainly in the 70s and then the work of Bud Hopkins in the 80s and people like that, it really took off massively. But Van Tassel was talking about this genetic link, and Mary being pregnant, and that Jesus was like a combination of us and them. He was talking about that in like 1958.
Yeah, that's crazy, man. And that one sentence I have highlighted here was, he was told that humans were molded and guided by ETs posing as gods for thousands of years. And that is right up my alley, because I love the stories of potentially inner earth beings coming up to the surface and manipulating it. I mean, we have stories from Constantine, Napoleon, Hitler, and Eisenhower all have met, or there's rumors that they met with something that seemed non-human. And I mean, right there, if you had that kind of directed contact, that's a lot of influence you could have over this world just by meeting with those four key players, and no one else would even know. Everyone else would just think they're crazy because no one else is having these widespread encounters. And I think that's really intriguing. I love that thread.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting angle what you bring up, the whole idea as well of entities underground. I mean, this sort of gets to an entirely separate but also credible theory, in my view at least. Granted, it requires that we believe in the possibility that there could be subterranean races deep underground. But on the one hand, it would make a great deal of sense if there were things like this, and possibly they even posed as extraterrestrials. I kind of think that's an interesting theory. It's one that, it's not a new one, and I think the most recent version of it was Matt Toney's The Crypto-Terrestrials book, the idea of like an ancient terrestrial race that moved underground when we kind of started to infest the planet and cause hassle, and so they just surface now and again, checking on what we're doing, because unfortunately they're forced to share the planet with this pretty warlike species, and if we destroy ourselves, we're going to destroy them as well. It's almost ironic, people chasing UFOs and aliens. If you look at it from the perspective, well, most of the aliens, they don't wear helmets. They seem perfectly accustomed to our gravity and our oxygen levels and everything else. They're always worried about what we're going to do to the planet. Maybe that's because all of that is because they really are from the planet, and they're forced to share it with us. And what better way to protect their real identities than to consistently and constantly keep telling us, oh yeah, we're extraterrestrial and this is what we're doing, etc., etc. It would be kind of a logical thing that people like that might do.
Yeah, and I had another guest, Michael Mott, who brought up the idea that a lot of these stories involve genetics. Well, why would some beings be able to travel from Zeta Reticuli to here but not have an advanced genetics program? I mean, ours is almost pretty advanced. And why would the genetics be compatible? Yet, if there was a subterranean race that maybe survived a previous cataclysm and has been kind of pulling the puppet strings throughout history from below, they would have compatible genetics to some degree.
No, you're right. I mean, Mike's written some good stuff on that theory, and he's got a lot of good, solid data in his books. And it's good that, there's somebody who has and still is focusing on that one area. Because you're right. I mean, what are the it's one thing to say that entities from some faraway star system would come here and possibly would want to sort of tinker with us and figure out our genetics. But for them to come here and for us to be so compatible to where supposedly they can create sort of hybrid babies and hybrid children with complete ease, and they can operate, like I said, in our atmosphere. They seem to have no trouble doing that, and they always seem to want to tell us that we're from here or we're from there. Mm-hmm. That makes me a little bit suspicious. It's almost like they're overplaying the card to overemphasize, and the danger is that sometimes people think, well, hang on, some come from Venus, some come from this star system, some come from that star system. We're pummeled with names and planets and stars. Could there really be that many different races coming, or could it be kind of a ruse to keep us all running around like headless chickens when the real secret that we should be looking deep below us remains hidden?
Yeah. I mean, just being in the conspiracy world, we're always trying to figure out who's at the top of the pyramid, who are the real string pullers. And that gets really interesting to me, that it might be some small group of strange-looking humans that have been here way longer than us that are just manipulating us through, like George Van Tassel said, the use of religion, getting Constantine to have a vision on the field, the Tibetan who met with Hitler, the Greys who met with Eisenhower. I mean, who knows if these are all just different ways of expressing the same group of beings.
Well, I sometimes wonder, when it comes to this sort of underground, ancient humanoid, crypto-terrestrial thing, if things like the Men in Black could be connected, not the government side of it, which is a limited angle, but sort of the weirder Men in Black, these sort of creepy, 5-foot-tall, skinny, pale ones that generally only surface at night, and they cover themselves up with trench coats and pulled-down fedoras and sunglasses. Maybe they do that to menace us, which works, but maybe also it's a camouflage, so these underground dwellers can move amongst us when they need to. Yeah. And perhaps they adopt, the imagery of the Men in Black as a means to do that. Maybe if they lived under the ground all the time, they would be pale looking. Mm-hmm. And coming out in the day wouldn't be that good for them. It'd be kind of taxing, particularly in the West Coast heat or whatever. So they come out at night predominantly to do what they've got to do, and it's cooler, and they're able to cope with things easier.
Yeah, that's a great point too. And Another area that this kind of dovetails into is also something you wrote about in the book. There have been researchers I've interviewed who talk about, or they speculate, I guess, about a serious high-tech war of mass destruction in the ancient past. And we're talking about a group that might have survived a natural cataclysm, but they also might have survived some type of massive war. But there's a considerable amount of physical evidence out there that suggests there might have been some massive nuclear or other type of energy war fought in the ancient past, isn't there?
Yeah, there actually is, and if you want a little scoop, which no one else has yet, that's actually the subject of a forthcoming book from me, like an entire book on that subject.
Boom.
The idea of we're not the first to develop atomic weapons, and maybe there were multiple civilizations, whether localized or worldwide, possibly more likely to be localized in certain areas, that came before us and destroyed themselves. But a lot of people scoff at the idea, but throughout all cultures, pretty much, you can find stories, legends, whatever you want to call them, of highly advanced human civilizations that peaked and then mysteriously vanished or destroyed themselves. I mean, perfect examples are like Atlantis. Now, a lot of people relegate the story of Atlantis, which came from Plato, and the story is that, well, it was just an invention of Plato. But the more you look into it, the more you find that the likelihood is that a lot of these ancient stories of Atlantis were based upon, if you like, sort of word of mouth passed down through the generations, oral traditions of highly advanced cultures that possessed incredible technology and that destroyed themselves. If you look at things like, for example, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, talking about sort of ancient confrontations in ancient India. You have these stories about these iron rods being unleashed and cities destroyed and gigantic flashes and people falling down dead and fingernails falling out and things like that. It kind of sounds like eerily like early descriptions of nuclear war, but from the perspective of people who generations down the line remembered the legends but didn't have an understanding of what nuclear war was. And so we've got things like that. We also have sort of a lot of anomalous craters around the world, which show evidence of where the sand has been turned to like fused glass. Now, this actually relates to something called trinitite. Trinitite was a substance that was found at the site of the first atomic bomb test in Alamogordo, New Mexico in 1945, just before the two atomic bombs were dropped on Japan to end the war. But the first test, or essentially the only test before the two bombs were dropped, was at this place called the Trinity site. And when it was safe enough to go out to the site, the scientists and technicians found this fused glass that became known as trinitite. And basically, it occurs, the sand becomes like a glass. It's actually not glass, but it's like a glass-like substance when it's exposed to incredible heat. And there are various places in the Middle East, particularly Israel, where archaeologists digging down at lower and lower levels came across, particularly in the 50s, what sounded chillingly like trinitite. The theory again being that certain areas of the planet were razed to the ground in atomic skirmishes tens and tens of thousands of years ago. Now, of course, this requires us to sort of rewrite the history books on when the human race was developing and civilized. Most conservative archaeologists and historians are sort of willing to go back sort of 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years, to the early years of settlement that wasn't just sort of people living in caves or whatever, But this would require us to go back tens and tens of thousands of years, because if we were talking anything less than that, I think we would see far more remnants and evidence of it. And I don't think we're talking about sort of worldwide civilizations like we have today. I think we're talking about possibly where there could well have been highly advanced cultures in India, Pakistan, Middle East, South America, which is what a lot of these stories about these ancient nuclear attacks suggest. But the rest of the world may still have been living, like the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals. That may have all been going on in one part of the world at the same time as the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons, were fighting woolly mammoths for food, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're talking about a worldwide culture, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if entities, civilizations had flourished, destroyed themselves, and then they become legend.
Yeah.
Maybe 20,000 years from now, we'll be somebody's Atlantis, People will say, that's nonsense, we're the first, there was no one before us.
Yeah, there was no America. But that's funny because it's just like an old Einstein quote that I always really liked. He said something to the effect of, I don't know what weapons the Third World War will be fought with, but the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones. I mean, that implies like the secular nature of increasing technology, destroying yourself, and then rebuilding.
Well, yeah, I mean, that actually brings home a good point, because a lot of people, with all the rumblings with Vladimir Putin threatening to put missiles back in Europe, and then we've got to do the same, and a build-up with Iran and North Korea, a lot of people said, well, this is all going to spill over into nuclear war, and we should launch first and just get it over with. A lot of people who say that, it's dangerous, because they don't realize that even in today's world, with the Cold War over and Russia being Russia, not the Soviet Union, we all still have enough missiles to flatten each other.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't know that the missiles we have today, their capability is like 70 times more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan. If anybody's seen the explosions on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the devastation death they caused, you imagine one bomb, 60 to 70 times the power of that. And then, we have hundreds. The Russians have hundreds. The Chinese do. Nobody would win. And it wouldn't be a case of like in these stupid old 1950s eras warnings, for propaganda warnings, where when the alarm goes off, get under a table with a blanket,
Right.
That would be, it's ridiculous. It would be complete destruction for everybody, and you would have, there was actually a British study, it was undertaken, it was classified for years because the government didn't want to worry the population, and the time, this was the 60s when the population in the UK was about 45, 50 million. They estimated 35 to 40 million would die in the blast, which would leave 10 million or so left, at which they figured about 8 million would die from injuries, burns, and radiation poisoning. And within a year, the population would have gone from like 55 million to perhaps 1 million, if that. And those would be, would die younger. They would, develop leukemia or whatever through the radiation. Their children would be stunted. They would certainly be illiterate. They would have no understanding of electricity or concept of television or nothing. They would be back to barbarism, essentially.
Yeah.
And their offspring, within two generations, we would be back to just primitive people again.
Yeah, man. And I always wonder if the elite have at least some of these same curiosities about gaining insight and technology from a more advanced past. And one thread that kind of jives with that's also in your book is researchers have talked about thinking that there's a subtext to many wars and military occupations, that the elite are trying to get some type of ancient knowledge or artifacts from the region. And we did hear some stories about Iraq and the looting of the museum there, which might kind of tie in here, but it is an interesting saga. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, it is an interesting story. It's a strange one as well, appropriately strange. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the invasion of Iraq, just from a down-to-earth perspective of the fact that Osama bin Laden was actually in Afghanistan. That's one thing, but that's beside the point. One of the stories is that at least a portion of the invasion of Iraq was prompted by, like you said, suspicions, theories, ideas that maybe ancient technology really did exist, whether extraterrestrial or something that, ancient civilizations from here developed into question. But a lot of these rumors surrounded, like, for example, the stories of the Anunnaki, the idea of these manipulative, powerful extraterrestrials visiting the Earth thousands and thousands of years ago, and stories range from them doing genetic experiments, the gods coming down and mating with the women of men, those legends, and also using us as slave races. But one of the theories is that the Anunnaki had found ways to massively extend their lifespans, and that some evidence of these technologies remained deep in the heart of Iraq. And again, one of the conspiracy theories is that, units went in to try and find this sort of ancient Anunnaki technology, essentially to provide it for the elite. You'd have an elite that could extend their lifespans to who knows how many years. I mean, right. It is an interesting fact that there are a lot of puzzles as to why we age the way we do, and why in today's world we live to sort of an average of about 85. Why is that? Why don't we just keep going to, say, 185 and age slower? So there are a lot of questions, as to why we're on that time scale in the same way that a cat might live to 17 or 18. So that is an interesting theory. But bolstering that idea of government agencies taking an interest in the mysteries of the very distant past, I have a chapter in the book about the CIA's quest to find Noah's Ark. Now, you think of the CIA, you think of overthrowing evil dictators in South America or the Middle East, assassinations, that kind of thing. You don't expect them to have a fairly extensive file on Noah's Ark, but they actually do. And it's surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act. Or various files have surfaced over the years, which collectively amount to about 70 or 80 pages, plus a number of documents and 1949-era photographs from the Air Force, which seem to show some sort of object embedded in the ice high in the peaks of Mount Ararat. And, of course, this sort of ties into a degree with the stories of George Van Tassel. And, I sort of speculate, is it possible that we know for sure that government agencies were interested in George Van Tassel's theories about Noah's Ark being some sort of space ark that possibly even crashed on Mount Ararat, sort of like an ancient Roswell or something like that. The fact that they were interested in that has to make you wonder if somebody then thought, well, if it's true, and this was the 50s as well, maybe we should take a closer look at what's allegedly seen on Mount Ararat. That might explain why the Air Force and the CIA had repeated missions with, like, the U-2 spy plane to get imagery of allegedly Noah's Ark. And we also know from a former CIA guy named Miles Copeland, who was the station chief in Damascus, that the CIA in 1947 was very interested in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Miles Copeland, who just had nothing to do with the story, but he was actually the father of Stuart Copeland, the drummer with the Police, and just like a strange little aside there. But Miles Copeland said that the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls was of deep interest to the CIA, and apparently they got their hands on one scroll found at Qumran, where the other scrolls are found, which never ever has made it to the official famous collection, that you can see. He said it went direct to the CIA after it was brought into the embassy in Damascus, and it was sort of surreptitiously sent over to Washington, D.C. and disappeared in the CIA's vaults. So we know for sure through the Freedom of Information Act that there is interest in the mysteries of the past, and I don't think government agencies have all the answers to what went on in the past. They may not actually have any solid answers, but there's no doubt from reading the files that there are certain people who've had deep suspicions that in the distant past there were advanced technologies, and that if we could tap into them today, it could perhaps even radically change, our society even as well.
Yeah. And that is an interesting aside. It wouldn't be the first time that the CIA would have family ties to famous musicians. That seems to be a thread that ran pretty strong in the 60s. But I am a little bit curious. We were talking about the ancient search for the secrets of immortality or life extension, and you talk about that a little bit in terms of this white gold powder, or maybe that this might be what they call manna in the Bible, and that might have some type of effect on longevity, and it might tie into the era of Gilgamesh, because apparently he reigned for 120 years. Who knows how old he was when he took the crown, but if that number is correct, they definitely had something going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is one of these areas where, no pun intended, it's like an article of faith, really, literally it is, in the sense that you either have to accept that somehow in the distant past certain people, elite people, lived massively extended lives, or it was just a fable to try and emphasize the importance of these people. Now, of course, Noah and Methuselah was Methuselah being the oldest person in the Bible, allegedly, of course, and Noah, lived massively extended lives. You also have like the story about Nepishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which talks again also about a flood, and people in relation to that scenario for the flood being granted extended lives by the gods. And you're right, manna, the white powdered gold, the various other ones, one in India as well. And a lot of cultures have stories of things like these substances, magical plants that can extend the human lifespan. And I often think that when you have cultures totally separate to each other, that just possibly, but they're telling very similar stories, that there's, often a basis in fact, like flood legends. The specifics differ, but the basics are very often the same, that numerous cultures have flood legends. So when you find numerous stories from different cultures and eras of people having extended lifespans, either it's not true or it is. And if it is true, what is the secret that allows, either the slowing of the aging process or the regeneration of cells? These are issues that are actually quite deeply still being studied. There are people who've written extensively on the, I'm not talking about just people outside of the field, but people in the world of medicine studying very closely why we age, how we age, and what can be done to combat it. So, maybe somebody really did tap into the answer thousands of years ago, and perhaps today people suspect it, and they're trying to find out if that data somewhere still exists, and if it does, can we find it and use it?
Yeah, that would be so interesting to find out. I mean, even Sumerian and Egyptian pharaohs, they have long reigns as well. And when they're talking about a white type of gold powder, I wonder if it might tie into the lost art of alchemy, which is really intriguing also.
Well, yeah, I mean, alchemy, it's kind of similar thing. The whole idea of transmutating one thing into another. Essentially, you're talking about a similar thing. The whole philosopher's stone, that sort of angle. You're talking about essentially altering something into something else, mutating it, and maybe some of that is at the heart of this whole immortality angle, the idea that there is actually a way to slow or possibly even stop the aging process. Nobody's saying that Noah and Methuselah lived forever, but they certainly lived tremendous amounts, supposedly, centuries and centuries, almost 1,000 years. So again, it's how, I'm not a particularly religious person either, so it really depends on how you interpret it, whether you interpret the stories as real or not, or you interpret it as like a magical substance like manna, or you interpret it as a science and technology, medical-based, genetics-based, that really does exist. And, who knows? And I wouldn't be surprised if, true or not, it wouldn't surprise me if attempts had been made to at least check out these different sites and parts of the planet where the stories were coming from, because government agencies do spend a lot of money on unusual subjects, so it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination to suggest someone had looked into something like that.
Yeah, and on the subject of going back a little bit to the Museum of Iraq, the Natural Museum of Iraq being ransacked during the invasion, one note I did have here is that the colonel who was kind of in charge of at least trying to get some of that stuff back, there was a quote from him that you had down where he said, "It's inconceivable to me that the basement was breached and the items stolen without an intimate insider's knowledge of the museum, and about 10,000 pieces were stolen and only 650 recovered." I mean, that's a lot of stuff, and who knows if the whole war was just a guise to get that stuff. I mean, Hitler, he sent a lot of campaigns out there looking for occult artifacts. Maybe we're doing the same.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the story, the looting of the alleged looting, well, we know there was genuine looting of the Baghdad Museum. There's no doubt about that. But one of the theories that's being put forward was that when it happened, the looting was sort of encouraged, and under cover of all the chaos that was going on with the genuine looting, that there were certain people in the know who knew very well where they wanted to go and target certain portions of the museum, particularly the basement areas, and get their hands on, well, whatever it was they wanted to get their hands on. Now, We know, for example, that legitimate attempts, very good attempts, were made by the US military to try and salvage and get back as much of this material evidence as possible. But then you have the theory that there was like another sort of far more covert group, that the group that was doing the good work didn't even know this other body existed. So in other words, you had two arms possibly of one agency with different agendas, one to legitimately try and save for posterity all this amazing historical material and historic material, and someone else that wanted to grab it, and amid all the chaos and the looting and the anarchy going on in the museum, that it allowed somebody to sort of move in under the radar and grab whatever they wanted.
Yeah, man, I think that's so fascinating. And if there ever was a chaotic invasion of America somehow, I mean, the Smithsonian is rumored to have all kinds of things in their basement, and if you could get down there and disclose what's there, I mean, I feel like it would probably be similar to the 10,000 artifacts that could be hidden away in the basement of an Iraqi museum.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, it has a more up-to-date parallel as well, that when the war was Second World War was spiraling down to an end, you had, like a lot of Hitler's cronies, planning to smuggle ancient artifacts, massive amount of paintings and priceless statues and artifacts. Some of it was siphoned through the Vatican into their vaults. There are rumours today even of, massive underground areas where supposedly ancient artwork and thousands of years old statues, things like this, are still preserved and stored in like old reworked train tunnels and underground installations and old military factories that were built by the Nazis during the war that may have been converted, and some of this material evidence might still be still standing there somewhere. So there's a lot of you don't just necessarily have to go into the distant past. We can find more recent stories as well of priceless artifacts being hidden away during the chaos of war or whatever.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Not that this is something you wrote about in the book, but I'm curious if you've ever stumbled across or heard any rumors or legends any further about the Vatican vaults, because that is something I don't hear about too often, but they've got to have a trove. I mean, they are one of the oldest power centers in this round of recorded history. I'm so curious what they might have behind the veil there.
Well, yeah, I mean, this, that could be a book all of its own, and certainly, people have written books on this particular subject. The idea of at the end of the Second World War, some sort of collaboration between the Vatican and the hierarchy of the Nazis and so forth, and giving them safe haven and storing Nazi gold and things like that. And now, of course, a lot of the stories are controversial and open to interpretation, and many of them are sort of lacking in hard evidence, but it's one of these things where there's smoke, maybe there's some fire, and if there is smoke, we should go looking for that fire. I've not personally sort of dug into that angle myself, but I mean, there's certainly no shortage of accounts out there, put it that way.
Yeah. And another personal favorite in this book of yours was this piece From Babylonia to the Department of Defense, Alien Demons. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, this is something that a few years ago I wrote a book on the subject called Final Events, and I summarized it and also added sort of some of the newer revelations to the chapter in the book. Basically, the story began, or for me it began, in 2007, but for the story itself began in 1991 when a Lincoln, Nebraskan priest named Ray Beauchesne was contacted by two Department of Defense physicists. Now, Ray Beauchesne has an interesting background because he's a former state director for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. He still lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. But he's also an Anglican priest. And that seems to be the reason why these guys on this Department of Defense program contacted him, because he had knowledge and a background in ufology, but also in religion. And the story they told him in a personal meeting at a hotel in Lincoln, Nebraska in November 1991 was that the Pentagon was working on a program to contact what they had called NHEs, non-human entities. And it wasn't like a Close Encounters of the Third Kind scenario, we're going to go out to one location and they're going to come down. It wasn't like that. It was more like the remote viewing type programs of the 70s, where they would use mind power, if you like, psychic phenomena, to try and call in these entities, which they never saw. It was almost like an ethereal, non-physical intelligence, but that could possibly take on physical form, or almost like a holographic type situation. And they supposedly the story was that they legitimately thought, to begin with, they were dealing with extraterrestrials. Over time, they noticed that, well, I couldn't fail to see that something very sinister started to happen, namely that there was a lot of bad luck on the program. People fell sick, died, there were some deaths. There were just, everything seemed to go wrong. It was like a canopy of darkness and doom had fallen on the project. And they came to believe that what they were dealing with was not extraterrestrials, but sort of manipulative, literal demons from a literal hell that were masquerading as extraterrestrials. And they came to believe that the entire UFO phenomenon was like a worldwide deception. The idea of sort of Satan's minions getting their hands into us via various ruses and guises over the year, like extraterrestrials, goblins, incubus, succubus, fairies, strange creatures. They believe that they were all demonic in nature and changed their appearance throughout the years and the centuries to manipulate, the human race and seduce them, so to speak. So they essentially wanted Ray Bauchet's advice on what they should do. And so Ray basically said, well, he felt that it was some sort of satanic deception, so he basically confirmed what they thought. But they opened up more to him and said that the program, despite everything that happened, continued, and they tried almost to do what, I guess, the closest thing you could imagine to like a Faustian pact, literally the Pentagon doing a deal with the devil to understand the technologies that the demons had, possession, controlling people, things like that. They wanted to use it against the Soviets. Is it possible that demonic powers could stop somebody's heart? If they could, could they assassinate presidential people in Russia, in the Kremlin? Could they wipe out the highest echelons of the KGB using demonic powers, or even persuading these demonic entities to do it for them? Yeah. But of course, the stories being demons, they hate us all. They couldn't care less if what country we're from. But it's a very strange story, and the thing I specifically talk about in the chapter is how this particular group spent massive amounts of time poring over old manuscripts and books and pamphlets and documents, going back centuries, that dealt with demonology and the history and folklore of demonology and beliefs and the myths and, everything from, as they saw it, the reality of demonology through to just the myth and legend. But they sort of ate it all up, so to speak. So it's sort of a fascinating but also creepy story of a very deeply buried, highly classified program in the Pentagon that was studying demonology as a means to try and turn it into a weapon and harness it and use it. And funnily enough, there's actually a new movie out right now called The Atticus Institute, which actually, aside from the UFO angle, it covers pretty much the same story of, it's set in the 70s. It's like one of these found footage type movies, like a Blair Witch type thing. Yeah. It's a pretty good one, and it deals with like a Pentagon group, DOD group, that focuses on a woman who's possessed by a demon, and they try and talk to the demon and do a deal with it and try and harness the powers and use them against the Soviets. And it's not like some big budget sci-fi thing. It actually works well because it's like a very lower budget, claustrophobic type of thing set in a couple of just 2 or 3 rooms the entire movie, but it works pretty well.
That's cool. Yeah, the parts of that piece that I really did think was the most interesting was some of the research that they were looking into from these demon researchers of the 3rd and 4th century that you mentioned. They were kind of talking about the plot of the succubi to enslave human souls, and that is fascinating. I mean, I wouldn't come to the conclusion that it was literal demons from a literal hell, because that's really not my paradigm, but it does remind me of the archons of Gnosticism, the mind parasites, and I think there's some real parallels there of a multidimensional entity trying to run humanity.
No, I actually agree with you. I mean, you make a very good point, because I share pretty much an identical viewpoint to what you just said. When people ask me, well, you've written about all this. Do you think the whole UFO phenomenon is demonic, that these things are demons? I say no, because the reason being that the term demon for most people sort of brings forth several images. One is, the simplistic idea of the imagery of the devil, horns, forked tail, fiery pit and flames, and all that kind of thing. And it also creates imagery of sort of demonic possession and spinning heads and puking green pea, soup or whatever. But if you avoid using the terms like demon, which creates, archetypal imagery that people have through pop culture, etc., I do believe that there's a very good chance that the UFO phenomenon isn't extraterrestrial, but could far more likely be sort of interdimensional, coexisting with us in some other realm that can cross paths with ours. And I actually do think there's good evidence from a lot of the cases that whatever these entities are, they actually don't like us at all. They're highly manipulative. People like John Keel warned about the dangers of dabbling in all this and how it often comes back and hits people in the face, so to speak. So do I believe the phenomenon could be deceptive, multidimensional, and malevolent to a point of hatred? Yes, I do. So in that sense, I kind of share the viewpoint of those who believe they're demons, but I don't think they're literal demons coming from a hell. You could make an argument that if there is an afterlife, that stories of heaven and hell may have been ancient attempts by the people of those eras, not overly conversed in science, to try and explain what in reality could be multi-dimensions. Yeah. You could make a case that heaven is another dimension, and if some, none of us really know, but if some essence of the body survives and goes on to some other realm, maybe it's an essence that of the mind or the brain which will be explainable via science, and maybe there'll be a science that can explain how it sort of translates from this existence to some other dimension beyond this.
Yeah.
And so that would sort of tie in with all the ancient beliefs, but it would put a scientific slant on it rather than a religious slant.
Mm.
So in that sense, I do share some of the theories of the group, where the major area I differ is that they literally viewed it from a religious perspective and would not even, give any consideration to anything else. It was demons or nothing,
Right, yeah. I hate when someone will take a story like that and use it as a justification that this whole big world is really just a God versus the devil type of paradigm. Yeah. But I do think that it's really interesting because recently we did explore the idea that a major manipulation by these entities might take place at the time of death and might involve the whole go towards the light meme, because what better time to swoop in and do something, if they want to do something with the human mind or the human soul or consciousness, what better time than that moment of death to swoop in and manipulate?
Well, that's an interesting point, because most abduction researchers at some point have got stories about these entities essentially manipulating or trying to steal human souls. In Communion, for example, Whitley Strieber famously said that the entities that he met said that we recycle souls, that was essentially their entire task. John Mack, the late John Mack, he talked about the very same kind of things, the idea that somehow the human soul played more of a role in all of this than did sort of the genetic angle. You also find less stories, interestingly enough, in the cases that came to Bud Hopkins. He took a far more sort of nuts and bolts alien approach, but certainly Mack and Whitley Strieber, a lot of their work is heavily based around manipulation and the moving of the soul and life after death and weird death-based synchronicities experienced by people who'd had abduction encounters. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's something to all that, but the problem is, it's so controversial, it's so mysterious that it's like for all of us, you're never really going to know until hopefully a long way down the line we all find out,
Right.
But we don't find out.
I find it fascinating because the idea that we are not the apex predator on the planet, that we don't really have a handle on our shit, is really intriguing to me. It's like we're really ignorant infants if there's some kind of being that actually knows what happens at the moment of death and can snatch you up at that point and thrust you into, who knows, some type of reincarnation or funnel off your energy or whatever they do. Obviously, it must be important if they care so much.
Well, this gets back to a lot of what John Keel said, and also that Charles Fort said that, there could be bigger powers at work that we're just not seeing the big picture. It's an unfortunate situation, but you draw sort of the analogy with the cows in the field. Everything's blissful and fine until they get taken off to the slaughterhouse. Most people, even those who eat meat, don't really want to know what goes on in a slaughterhouse, but, they eat meat. There's a means to an end, and the herd is created to fulfill the needs of the top dog, basically,
Yeah.
Well, maybe we don't get to see the top dog until we die, and maybe it is the soul or some sort of energy. The closest analogy I can think of would be the sort of scenario in the Matrix, particularly the first Matrix movie, which sort of spells it all out. We live in, or we think we're living in this one particular world. Essentially, it's like a dream world, and when we wake up, if you wake up, you find you're in these pods, which essentially are designed to, take the electricity from the human body, the natural electricity in the human body, and turn it into like the equivalent of a battery for all these machines that now run the planet.
Yeah.
Maybe it's something like that it's impossible for us in this form, like a physical bodily form, to see the bigger picture. It's only when you exit that form that you're exposed to it, and maybe then it's like, oh no, that's when you get loaded aboard that truck, and to the slaughterhouse or whatever. I mean, I wouldn't want to give people nightmares, which is actually, a lot of people who read, when I wrote that book, and also the material summarized in this book, a lot of people got really worried who sent me emails, were extremely worried by that scenario that, we're a herd and that we're somehow going to be used after death. That was the one thing I found more than anything else that people were really, I won't say just what were frightened about, it was sort of played on the mind a lot. I could tell that from the emails and messages I got.
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea, and it can be concerning too, but I mean, what can you do? You might just enjoy the grazing for a few decades, and then whatever happens, happens. But that's also why I'm so interested in psychedelics. And there's a subtext to Zen culture and New Age culture where they talk about how important it is to do the work, to raise your consciousness, to meditate, and maybe that is to prepare yourself for that moment so that you are less likely, less susceptible to being tricked if you have experience in out-of-body experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting that because Whitley Strieber said, I forget if it was in Community or not, but he'd been told by military personnel that the ability of these things to use us and manipulate us and control us was based on the extent to which we believed in them, and the less we believed in them, the less power they had. So it's almost as like somehow denying them lessens their ability to affect us. And that might tie in with, religious beliefs that if you're a strong believer in God, everything's going to be cool. It's actually kind of like a similar parallel. If you're not a believer, they have a better chance of getting their claws into you. That might explain the old legends where if you're not a believer, you're going to burn in hell.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you talk about psychedelics, a lot of really good research has been done into how, things like, for example, like DMT. A lot of researchers and skeptics will say, well, DMT just provokes graphic hallucinations in the mind. Even if it does, so many of those hallucinations are, near identical in the sense that people feel or they see, something coming through from the veil, very often small entities. There's a degree of communication, even if it's sort of couched in cryptic words and, symbolism. But it's almost like entering an altered state is like retuning a radio. You're constantly on one channel until you decide to move the dial. Maybe it's a similar thing, that psychedelics allow us to move a dial in the mind. No, not a literal dial, obviously, but you know what I mean. And to open a doorway. Now, there's a really good book. I don't know if you've seen it, and I recommend you get it on the show because it's a really good book. It's just come out called A Trojan Feast by Joshua Cutchin.
No, not familiar.
Oh, it's a really good book, just published by Anomalous Books about a month ago. And it deals with the entire book. It's called A Trojan Feast because it deals with all the stories or interactions between people who claim to have met aliens and sort of magical entities, where there's a food factor, where you know, the entities provide us food or they request food. And it's clear, I won't give the entire plot away, but it's a non-fiction book, I should stress, but it talks about how maybe these entities construct almost like a holographic type of imagery where the communal sharing of food is actually like an image designed to put us at ease and allow us to try and have some understanding and connection and like relationship with these things, which are actually so literally alien that if they appeared and manifested in normal fashion, we wouldn't comprehend them. So they try and put us at ease and give us something to relate to. And Joshua talks about how that may explain a lot of the absurdities about people in abduction cases or contactee cases, being given plates of food, which sounds ridiculous. They come off the flying saucer with a plate of food. But if you look at it, he gives a really good convincing argument as to how and why these might be sort of hallucinations projected into the mind, as I said, to try and ease what would be just a too mind-blowing, shocking experience that we could not understand. They have to find a middle ground, something we can relate to, and sort of feasting together, a communal, meeting is something that we can relate to, if you like.
Wow, man. Yeah, that is really interesting. I'm definitely going to have to look that up. This has been really awesome. About out of time. I mean, I got to page 2 of my 6 pages of questions for you. As you know, you have the book split up into ancient aliens and then a conspiracy section, and I just totally avoided the conspiracy section. Maybe a few months down the road, I can pick up my notes again and we can tackle some of the more practical and more modern human-based things that you have in there.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Awesome, man. Well, I definitely loved it. It's always great to get to talk to you on and such a variety of things too. And I guess remind people where they can keep up with you and anything else you got going on before we call it in.
Yeah, sure. I have a blog called World of Whatever, so you just Google Nick Redfern World of Whatever, or people can look me up on Facebook, on Twitter, and I've got an Amazon page as well. And people want to contact me if they got questions, if they want any advice. I'm always happy to try and help. If they want to steer in any particular directions or of data, I'm happy to do that. Or if they just want to chat, I'm always around to do that.